Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unravel one of the most fascinating and, honestly, most persistent mysteries in our history. How do we actually define American identity? I mean, you look around today and we see an incredibly diverse nation. But how did that diversity shape the very core of what it means to belong here? Well, we're going to journey through thousands of years of history and unpack some cutting-edge sociological research to find out. So what exactly makes someone American? I really want you to think about how you'd answer that. Is it a shared language? Is it a shared set of political beliefs? Or maybe a specific history? If you're sitting there finding it kind of difficult to pin down a single, simple answer, you are absolutely not alone. In fact, scholars have literally spent decades trying to figure out if there's a single measure of Americanism, and the data reveals a much more complicated reality. So the crucial point is, we don't just have one set of rules. This insight comes from a really fascinating sociological study out of Tufts University by Deborah Schildkraut. She wanted to see whether the increasing ethnic diversity of the United States is changing how we define our national identity. And her results were striking. She found that a complex and contradictory set of norms exist. Basically, we have this fractured, multifaceted identity that completely defies a single neat label. Which brings us to a concept called the multiple traditions theory. Schildkraut's study actually provides strong empirical backing for this idea. It proposes that an increasingly multicultural America essentially engenders a multi-creedal America. Think of it like a giant puzzle, a society defined by a broad range of constitutive norms rather than just one single creed. But why is our identity so fractured like that? To truly understand this multi-creedal society, we can't just look at the present. We have to look way back at the past, long before the United States was even a concept. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, the deep roots of diversity. Rewinding thousands of years. To really prove that this land was never a monolith, we've got to hit the rewind button. We so often think of American history starting in 1492 or 1607, but human history on this continent started tens of thousands of years earlier. The prevailing theory is that people from Eurasia followed game across Beringia, that's a land bridge that connected Siberia to present-day Alaska, perhaps as early as 30,000 years ago. By 10,000 BCE, Paleo-Indians were well established across the continent. And by 8,000 BCE, we see the first farming popping up in central Mexico. I mean, the sheer span of time before European contact is absolutely massive. And right from the get-go, these early inhabitants were incredibly diverse. As Paleo-Indians spread southward across the continent, they didn't just keep one single culture. They adapted to completely different environments. We're talking from the icy north to the deserts of the southwest, all the way to the eastern woodlands. Because of this, they quickly diversified into hundreds of culturally distinct groups, like the Clovis and Folsom cultures, and each of them had their own unique tools, languages, and ways of life. Moving on to Section 2, Complex Indigenous Empires, Shattering Preconceptions. We really need to shatter those traditional textbook preconceptions. These weren't just small, scattered bands of nomads. For example, 20,000. That was the estimated population of the Mississippian city of Cahokia at its peak in the 12th century. Located near modern-day St. Louis, Missouri, Cahokia was literally larger than the population of London at the time. It was this massive urban center built around a 100-foot-tall earthwork called Monk's Mound, and it featured complex class systems and incredibly expansive trade networks. And this brilliantly illustrates just how varied the continent was. You had the Mississippians building these giant mounds in the east. Down in the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans were constructing massive apartment-like stone and adobe dwellings built right into cliff faces, some had up to 800 rooms. Over in the Pacific Northwest, indigenous peoples established affluent permanent villages centered around salmon and the elaborate gift-giving feast known as the potlatch. Meanwhile, up in what's now New York, the Iroquois formed a highly sophisticated political confederacy led by 50 sachem chiefs. These were unique, diverse empires with totally disparate traditions. All right, Section 3, the European Patchwork, a chaotic collision. So, if the foundation of North America was already that incredibly diverse, introducing European colonization added a massive, frankly chaotic layer to our identity puzzle. It was definitely not just a single British event. Actually, the earliest recorded European mention of America was by Norse explorers around 1075 in a place they called Vinland. Later on, you had the Spanish establishing a presence in Florida and New Mexico. You had the Dutch, the French, and the Swedish all setting up their own settlements. It wasn't even until 1607 and 1620 that the British established Jamestown and Plymouth. It was a chaotic collision of different languages, goals, religions, and cultures all vying for space. Now, what's really interesting about this dynamic is how these differing European powers jockeyed for position and influence, and in the process created very distinct regional cultures. You had the Dutch settling the mid-Atlantic in places like New Netherland. They actually acted as a physical barrier to British expansion from New England, at least until the British eventually took it over and renamed it New York. Meanwhile, the Spanish had this massive, widespread colonial presence across Florida, Texas, and New Mexico that deeply influenced the culture and architecture of those regions, and you can still clearly see those influences today. Of course, we absolutely must acknowledge the severe consequences of this collision. As Europeans arrived, yes, they brought horses and livestock, but they also brought new Eurasian diseases like smallpox and measles. Native Americans had zero immunity to these diseases, which triggered horrific epidemics that decimated the previously established populations. This, combined with territorial wars and harsh forced labor structures, like the Spanish encomienda system, completely devastated the existing indigenous societies. As the United States officially formed and continued to aggressively expand its borders, it folded even more disparate populations and traditions into the nation. The southern colonies built an agricultural system by enslaving millions of people from Africa. Then, the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the arrival of millions of European immigrant workers fueling industrialization. The U.S. also acquired much of the American Southwest from Mexico following the Mexican-American War in 1848, and later annexed the independent Hawaiian Kingdom and the island of Puerto Rico. With every single expansion, new cultures, new languages, and new histories were woven right into the fabric of the country. Which brings us to Section 4, a multi-creedal America, synthesizing past and present. Let's see how all this historical evidence builds directly into the modern findings of that Tufts University study we talked about earlier. The data from Deborah Sildkraut's research shows something pretty incredible. It shows that most Americans, regardless of their ethnic or immigrant background, actually share this complex view of the norms that constitute American identity. The ultimate takeaway here is that our shared identity is, paradoxically, our acceptance of complexity. We inherently understand that there's no single way to be American, because, well, there never has been. Let's connect the dots here. The sheer historical diversity of North America is the exact reason for our complex, contradictory norms today. From the hundreds of distinct Paleo-Indian cultures to the towering city of Cahokia to the chaotic patchwork of Spanish, Dutch, and British colonists, all the way to the continuous influx of immigrants and annexed territories, this land has always been a collision of different worlds. The deep indigenous roots and the European patchwork we just explored literally created the multi-creedal society we live in now. Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought to ponder. If our history is a patchwork of empires, traditions, and creeds, isn't complexity the most American trait of all? As you go about your day, I really want you to reflect on how this vast, contradictory history shapes your own definition of identity. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking questions.